All right, it is Sunday, September 12th, 2021, and I'm recording this video right after our group discussion centered on Ernesto Laclau's On Populist Reason, Chapter 1. So I want to record for myself and for people who are in the group and for people who might join the group discussion at a later point. I want to record some of the highlights of our meeting and some of the highlights of the discussion and what we got from Laclau in this first chapter. If I get anything wrong or if my discussion is incomplete, please add to it in the comments here. So the general aim of Laclau is expressed here in one of the passages early on page 7. So he wants to understand in a sympathetic way, in a way that is not antagonistic to populism. He wants to understand what it is that gives rise to it, its roots, and as well as its effects, its possible consequences, what reinforces it. So on page 7, we read, quote, "It is not necessary that the features constituting the populist syndrome be reduced to a logically unified model, but at least we should be able to understand what are the family resemblances which, in each case, have governed the circulation of the concept." Conovan, for instance, points out that the populist movement in the USA was not only a farmers' agrarian movement, but also had a prominent political aspect as a grassroots revolt against the elite or plutocrats, politicians, and experts. So against those privileged group, elites or plutocrats, politicians, and experts. So these are vague, impressionistic ways of grasping the notion of populism. And there is a reason why Laclau wants to not necessarily restrict himself and restrict his approach to logically unified model. That has been before him. The experts' approach or scholars' approach to populism was a kind of conceptual analysis approach that sought to find logically consistent ways of handling the concept populism. And since with that expectation, when they confronted discourse arising or about populism, once they discover that there's not much logical consistency, or there's not much substance that can withstand logical scrutiny, logical analysis, then the scholars would say, oh, it's too superficial, it is not rigorous enough, it is not worthy of our attention. And then the attitude towards it would become negative and dismissive. And this is what Laclau wants to overcome, this attitude of this dismissive attitude, this negative attitude that is reinforced with this impression of vagueness, inconsistency, and multiplicity in a way that cannot be managed in a logically consistent way. All right, in the group discussion, I mentioned that we should probably keep in mind that the audience for Laclau's writing here is the academic elite or the scholars who have previously treated populism, the notion of populism, the history of populism with skepticism under a negative light. And I think that audience, they have specific disposition. They have the drive, the motivation to find definition of concepts, to examine populism with respect to its content or conceptual content, and the kind of conceptual content that can be generalized, can be expressed maybe in terms of ideal types with depth, a kind of conceptual content that has depth and consistency. And that means that they already have assumptions about the rationality and normalcy of agents in a society, agents who have well-founded beliefs that they can explain, and they act based on those well-founded beliefs. So the audience of Laclau, again, the academic audience Laclau is primarily, I think, writing to, and he has designed his language to be in continuing dialogue with them. They have these assumptions about rationality and normalcy. And those assumptions are set in such a way to keep populism at the margins of what is rational, at the margins of what is normal, at the margins of what can be constructive. So Laclau wants to deconstruct those assumptions. Something that Laclau brings in, and this Javier highlighted this with a really good phrase, and that is, rather than conceptual analysis, we should pay attention to how populist themes organize us, how they drive us to action, how they unite us, and in general, the way populism, the way populist ideas organize us, their effect, what they do for us, and what they enable us to do, what they enable us to feel and be motivated to do. So, in other words, we can pay attention to the forms that can be attached or associated to populism, not the content, not just the content. Things that we can identify in the domain of experience, not in necessarily in the domain of abstract concepts. We also talked about this the desire of this project to understand populism sympathetically, to see what is the reason, what is the rationale, the particular rationality, or the particular standpoint that makes populism, a populist movement, rational. That means adopting a standpoint from within it, a standpoint that reveals it's not as irrational, not as exclusively irrational and destructive and superficial and vague. One of the things that was very helpful for me was Laclau's attention to the dichotomy between the dichotomy of rhetoric and logic. So on page 12, we read that these academics, they are working with the most classical conception of rhetoric, grounding in its differentiation from logic. So, quote, the sociological equivalent of that to which rhetoric is opposed is a notion of social actors as constituted around well-defined interests and rationally negotiating with an external milieu. For such a vision of society, the image of social agents whose identities are constituted around diffuse populist symbols can only be an expression of irrationality. Okay, so rhetoric itself should be understood not as just a flourishing of language, not as manipulation and deception. Rhetoric itself is an element that is required because logic is not a closed system. It requires the rhetorical elements for its completeness. So again, going back to the text, page 13, quote, instead of starting with a model of political rationality, which sees populism in terms of what it lacks, its vagueness, its ideological emptiness, its anti-intellectualism, its transitory character, to enlarge the model or rationality in terms of a generalized rhetoric, what, as we shall see, can be called hegemony, so that populism appears as a distinctive and always present possibility of structuration of political life. An approach to populism in terms of abnormality, deviance, or manipulation is strictly incompatible with our theoretical strategy. All right, let's skip ahead and read one key paragraph. It's something that Laclau describes as an integral part of his project. This is from page 17. A first step away from this discursive denigration of populism is not, however, to question the categories used in its description, vagueness, imprecision, and so on, but to take them at face value while rejecting the prejudices which are at the root of their dismissal. As Javier said, we should take superficiality, vagueness, we should take these features and work with them. These are signs. They are, when something is superficial, when something is vague, it is not a vague or superficial version of something that must be formulated clearly, precisely, and in an in-depth manner. Maybe the vagueness and superficiality, maybe the transitory nature of something, maybe it is signaling something essential about it. Instead of counterposing vagueness to a mature political logic governed by a high degree of precise institutional determination, we should start asking ourselves a different and more basic set of questions. is not the vagueness of populist discourses the consequence of social reality itself being in some situations vague and undetermined? All right, I think that's all I wanted to quote from the chapter. This general relationship between abstract concepts and concrete, between constructs and experience, the actual substance of our lives, that is very relevant for Laclau's understanding of populism. What might give rise to populist tendencies is the recognition of the failure of a set of abstract concepts that are forcing themselves on our social, political, personal lives. And that objection, that reaction to the failure of these concepts that are given to us by experts, by authorities, that rejection, that refusal, that objection itself is not initially clear. And it doesn't have to be clear. It is itself initially an inkling, a sense of something not being right here. Something doesn't seem fair. And then populist authoritarian leaders can come in and take advantage of that situation by interpreting it in a way that is too specific, it is self-serving, divisive, and so on and so forth. But what the populist leaders, the so-called populist leaders do, how they interpret what they identify, is not everything that we can say about populist movements. All right, I think that's good for now. We are going to meet again in 2 weeks for this book, for the discussion of this book. We are going to meet in 2 weeks to discuss chapter 2, titled Le Bon, Suggestion and Distorted Representations. This chapter is only 10 pages, so it should be not that challenging. Other than that, I will meet some of you, hopefully many of you, hopefully all of you, in 1 week to have our first experimental group meeting, which is for now named Writers Group. Thank you so much for your generous support, and until next time.